Welcome to Risks and Trends, an annual Polityka Insight conference. This year, due to pandemic unpredictability, we've decided to organize a conference in studio without audiences. In 10 thematic blocks, together with our friends, partners and guests, we've tried to describe the world as we see it. My name is Wojciech Szacki. I'm a head of a political section of Polityka Insight. I invite you to Politics and Society panel. In the first panel, together with Monika Helak, I'll speak to sociologists Marta Bucholc and Michał Łuczewski of Warsaw University. We'll try to wonder how the epidemics change polls and to which extent these changes will be permanent. In the second part, with Andrzej Bobiński, we'll try to translate the conclusions of our guests into the language of current politics. Please feel invited to watch. We've been through a very tough year, probably the toughest in the history of the Third Republic of Poland. The number of excess deaths is more than 80,000 in comparison to previous decades. And this year also saw the break of many social bonds, including family, peer, and social bonds. So we wanted to ask you, as experts and researchers dealing with society and sociologists, to which extent these changes will be permanent. Has this year changed polls so deeply that we will wake up in 2021 when the pandemic is over in a completely different reality? Or everything will pretty much come back to the norm when we will complete our vaccination program and the epidemics will no longer be dangerous. And one of the issues which became very apparent in this tough 2020 was the notion of the state. And one can say that before, both politicians and citizens had to, but didn't have to, could, but didn't have to worry about the function of the state. Because on one hand, we had this political spectacle, and on the other hand, the necessity to work for living. And for the citizens and politicians, it was more important than to answer the question how to model our state. And then in March 2020, we saw the emergence of virus, and the epidemics changed this apathy about the functioning of the state and the role of the state. So where are we right now? Thank you very much for this invite. And I'm sorry that in my first words I will not agree with the notion behind the question that you posed, because I think that this apathy about the role of the state, this indifference that Monika, you mentioned, was quite common, but in Poland in recent years probably less common than our conventional wisdom would suggest, that we are just dealing with our little stabilization and we leave politics, the role of the state, to the politicians. I think that this notion was questioned on a number of occasions, but I will agree, obviously, that pandemics is putting this role of the state in a completely different light and different context. I remember that I think I wrote at the beginning of the pandemics that pandemia poses between us the vision of a state as a leviathan, a huge being which is stronger than any one of us, larger than any one of us, and this is the last instance to which we can resort when our security and safety is at risk. This huge state which has become a real guarantor of life and health of its citizens when they were faced with this huge biological catastrophe. Not many states were able to deal with it, to be universally applauded. And the citizens would say that, oh, we love our Leviathan, despite many interferences into the lives of citizens and the functioning of various autonomous spheres, and I'm referring here especially to the interferences in the religious rights, because please take a notice that the state started to interfere in the religious cult, which is an interesting context that seems to be overlooked during the pandemics. And the state decided to intervene very deeply, and despite the fact it is often deemed as very ineffective. So we have this awareness, new awareness of the role of the state and lack of satisfaction with the role of the state. So the pandemic has changed a lot. I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that what happened in 2020 is a certain dynamics which introduces the societies into much more radical dynamics, and then this dynamic is going to be repeating itself. So we are not dealing with the fact that last year was a new reality, but it revealed a new social dynamics which will be repeating itself. What do I mean by this new dynamic? First, we saw a global epidemics, the first epidemic of such a global scale, which creates a lot of anxiety in the people. In the past, we thought that anxiety would come from outside, for example, the climate change, but now it seems that this anxiety can be absorbed by us and can deconstruct us from inside. So we are between the heating planet and ourselves. We're also getting fever. We are being deconstructed from inside, and this type of heating by epidemics leads to the situation whereby the societies are very anxious and they are going crazy almost. We no longer recognize these societies. We, the Poles, well, on the surface, we would say that we are no longer able to recognize ourselves because of this anxiety, and we are looking for some ways to handle it. And the first way was to introduce a very radical law, which will try to handle this pandemic. And it is an unprecedented global lockdown. And I would agree with Marta that people expected some activities on the side of the state. They expected the emergence of some kind of Leviathan, but the Leviathan will never fully satisfy us. Because from my standpoint, we see here some unconscious processes. Whenever there is an anxiety, we are always looking for savior, and there is nobody higher than the state, and the state should salvage us and save us. And then it is being criticized for failing to do so. And from this global lockdown, which is limiting this anxiety, but in reality it's increasing this anxiety, because you cannot go out, you cannot meet with your family, you almost can't breathe because you are closed in your apartment. And then the societies, not only the Polish societies, are choosing a different strategy, which is consisting in breaking the law. And I think that an example of that is BLM movement. We can also look at the Polish women's strike as another example. And previously a movement around Margot. But we can apply the same standard to what's happening in Belarus, Russia, or Germany. Every global movement can be treated as a way to handle this social anxiety. So moving from pandemics to global lockdown to global activity of Leviathan, and then we are trying to get out from all these constraints to start breathing again. And it is not a coincidence that Black Lives Matter has this main slogan was "I can't breathe." And in Poland, we are also resorting to this metaphor that we no longer can freely breathe in this country. So when I take a look at the social reality, we have this triple movement: pandemics, lockdown, and then some attempts to overcome the lockdown by breaking the rules, and none of the strategies works. It doesn't make us feel better that we can start breathing. It seems that we continue to be unable to breathe. Yes, we are talking about the state because the state was a response to epidemics, and we were looking some escape from epidemics in the state. Has this interest in the state, this escape towards the state, and the escape under the wings of the state, will it be permanent? We have some protests right now in Poland, but they are not very massive. We don't have hundreds of thousands of people. This is a limited and niche movement. Are we facing, 2, 3, 4 months of this similar situation, because we hear that the restaurants will be opened around May? Can we infer that Poles will be more interested in the business of the state? Will they become more civic in what they do, how they think, and how they act? Every social movement, especially if it's directed vis-à-vis or towards the state, will meet some resistance of the state and will also create some counter movements. This kind of conflict, which may sound paradoxical, this kind of conflict means that people start being interested what is the source of this conflict. Well, on one hand, we can think that we see there is a collapse of community, and when pundits say that we have those two separate poles, we see this great polarization, but this polarization is about something, but we have to find the answer, what is it all about? So I look at it from the point of view of civic participation, that every polarization is a way to generate ideas. Why are we quarreling in the first place? Sometimes we don't know what is this quarrel all about, or this conflict is all about, but this conflict enables us to see what's at stake. And I think that in Poland, what's at stake is the question of law, the state, and religion. And these stakes are emerging as a result of the protest. They are not hidden somewhere on the laptops, but they are going to emerge often spontaneously. Because who could have forecasted that Polish women's strike will make some assaults about some of the Polish churches? Nobody have forecasted it, and this shows us what is the stake, what is at stake, what will be the shape of Polish Church, Catholicism, and Polish citizenship. So coming back to your question, Wojtek, this conflict will lead to increasing the interest by people about what's going around them. Because the conflicts are absorbing almost every member of the society. You have to say on which side you are at, and this is what will happen. And we'll also formulate some general visions about the state, about the religion, about society. What are the relationships between men and women? Where is a place for females in the public space? And also, where's the place for the unborn children? I do agree with Michał that the current situation enables us to define what is at stake in our conflicts, in our quarrels. However, answering Wojtek, to which extent it is helpful to define our attitude vis-à-vis the state, public affairs, and also this common good, other people. I have to admit that I would start from the citation from Bronisław Geremek. Normal people in abnormal situations act abnormally. What does it mean? Well, we have an abnormal situation, and I use this term in a very non-judgmental way. This situation is very atypical, abnormal, and even if it lasts quite long, in the scale of a human biography, it will be very abnormal. So this stimulus that Michał mentioned makes us statistically average normal people to behave in an abnormal way, and citizenship is connected with activities which are not abnormal or passing or transient. Citizenship is connected with permanent habitual acts. So when we ask about the citizenship and the influence of this abnormal situation on the Polish civic attitudes, we are asking how the attitudes resulting from abnormal situation will translate into the normal situation. Michał asked about the role of the law, and I think this is very important stake. The role of the law, respect for the law is also at stake. When we think about the citizenship in classical terms as an ability to be obedient and to observe the law, right now we have the situation which makes it impossible to be a good citizen, because on one hand, it is difficult to observe a law which you question. This is a situation connected with the verdict of the Constitutional Tribunal on abortion. I'm sure if the legal state in Poland has been developing since 2015 in a different way, if we didn't have any doubts whether this verdict is binding, the scale of the social protests would be incomparable to what we've seen. The undermining of the legitimization of the law bears serious consequences for civic attitudes, and I think that can be a permanent result of the pandemic, because the pandemic is unleashing this propensity to break the law. So from this standpoint, I think this is what it means to be a law-abiding citizen. Then the sense of taking part in lawmaking. If we have some standards or norms which are appearing from day to day, and this is obvious because they respond to the quickly the changing situation. But on the other hand, we see some standards and rules which we question. We don't have the clarity whether these norms are being adopted in a proper way, if they respect the legal system. Then we don't have a sense that we, as demos, as a political body, which delegated lawmakers, that we can trust these lawmakers, that we really take part in this lawmaking process. We have a doubt. So we don't have these two components of being a citizen. So from this standpoint, the fact that we are taking part in social movement actively, that we are taking to the streets, that we are defining the stakes of the Polish democracy, does not mean that our civic participation will increase. Our civic participation may decrease in a normal situation. But the question is, have we not reached the point where the political stage needs to remodel, because we may be on the cusp of some more radical movements. Maybe soon we'll see breaking of the windows. Well, in Poland, not even in the recent time, but over the recent years, the border of the violence was quite tempting for the participants of the social movement, and it was trespassed on a few occasions, but always Poles would get back behind this line. So they would not be breaking the law violently, and it all would end in a fun carnival manner. And I think the same will happen right now. When we take a look at the Polish women's strike, the trespass of the premises of Constitutional Tribunal by Klementyna Suchanow and her colleagues was an attempt. They crossed the line, but then we come back behind the fence. It could have opened a new social dynamics, but it is not happening. I've thought about one more thing, about these new movements, whether from this social dissatisfaction and dissent we can see the emergence of a new political force. Certainly this social discontent change the current political movements, and they are trying to tap into this new dynamic. For example, civic platform is a good example. It is the old guard, which is Rafał Trzaskowski, which is trying to participate in this movement. And it shows how this abnormal movement, but I'm using it in the neutral sense, is being used by this normal element of the political system, which leads to an increase of polarization, because if the parties which used to be the center parties, just like Civic Platform, and they were even perceived by some as conservative, if they are trying to take advantage of this social unrest connected with radical demands are shifting, and then this tension in Poland and this polarization increases, and the center of the stage is disappearing, which used to be solidly represented. Right now in Poland, it is more and more difficult to find centrist politicians, and it's difficult to find somebody who represents the center, or somebody who is representing the radical postulates of the left. So these new rituals lead to the change of the whole reconfiguration of the political stage, which is not to say that Marta Lempart will be able to lead a political party. For me, what is interesting is the dynamics of a ritual of Polish women in strike, which consists in throwing a challenge to Leviathan, but when Leviathan is not there, we see a war of everybody with everybody. Marta Lempart attacks the Leviathan, but then we see the emergence of various politicians. For example, Szymon Hołownia, and he says, we know it is a war, but let's calm down, and then we will calmly try to attack Jarosław Kaczyński. For me, this transition is very interesting because in Marta Lempart I see a lot of this explosive, archaic, spontaneous activity, which is later being managed in a cold, political, strategic way. And whenever Marta Lempart says it's a war, it is also a war against you, Szymon. Szymon is trying to canalize this social unrest against one person and also to build his potential on it. Paradoxically, Szymon Hołownia, as an adversary to the Polish women's strike and also a representative of Polish Christian intelligentsia, is still aiming to tap into this movement. He is taking advantage of it, and this is an interesting paradox. It would be very interesting for feminist analysis. How come that an unrest which is unleashed by a women movement is then managed and used by a male who is fitting it into the classical, old school polarization. And it seems that he could even replace Civic Platform when Kidawa-Błońska was unable to successfully compete in the presidential election. So I think what's happening today will impact the political configuration, but we'll see also these reverse effects that I've just described, which is not to say that in a longer term it can have formative importance for the youths, just like my daughter's generation. And maybe after years we will see the emergence of a new Polish left. It will be the Greens of 2050, the left which will remember about this foundation year. Thank you very much for this conversation. Today is Wednesday, February 17th, and the special edition of Monitoring Report with Wojciech Szacki will be in extraordinary conditions. Our discussion today is part of our annual conference Risks and Trends. Secondly, we sit in front of cameras. And thirdly, we'll be trying to move away what we like most, which is current events, and we'll try to talk about the future. Wojciech, the title of our discussion is How 2029 Will Change Polish Politics. Our today's monitoring report was preceded by a conversation with sociologists, and I jotted down a few of the threads that we would like to follow up on. We will try to translate it into the language of politics. Marta and Michał talked a lot about the role of state in pandemic. I think that in the recent months the state proved to be weaker, and we saw more of this state. How this change of the perception of the state can translate into politics and have the politicians notice in the first place? Well, I don't think that I'm not sure that the state seems to be weaker, because this diagnosis of the weak state was present in many of our diagnoses a year ago when we spoke with our friends and experts. Also, before that, this idea was quite present in the thoughts of our experts. For example, Rafał Matyja often refers to the weakness of the state. So it was a bit evidence-less, but the pandemic showed us that there is so many problems which the state faces, including coordination of tasks, preparing long-term plans, planning complicated logistical operations, and finally, the state of the health care, which was so clear in epidemic, and we now see the data from the previous year when it comes to the excess deaths. So how many more people died last year than normally? And Poland is unfortunately leading in this gloom statistics across the world and also in Europe, or mostly in Europe. So even if this death rate is not so high, when we take a look exclusively on the COVID-19 death rate, because last year it was about 30,000 people who died of COVID-19 or due to some more comorbidities, it doesn't give us a full picture of this catastrophe that we have seen of this excess death, because we had twice as many excess deaths, and all the data testifies that it's worse than in any other European states. You are referring to COVID-19, about the deaths and health care. I'm also thinking about the institutions. So far, the Sanitary Epidemic Authority was an institution which for me was closing dirty restaurants, but right now it turned out to be one of the most important institutions. We also have a matter of education. I have a child who is attending a public school, and usually I would drop this child off and then pick it up, and then it would I didn't have an idea how it worked, but now I was forced to physically participate in this educational process. So there is many junctions, and I have a sense that the state has become much more present in our everyday life than in normal times. It is also a shelter, not only for individual person, but also whole industries. I'm referring here to this famous shields, financial shields, 2030, you know, and so on and so forth. So the state has really become the only remedy, the only foundation that we can use as a shelter. Unfortunately, not everyone has a sense that it works as it should be working. So just like our predecessor sociologist said, on one hand we have this escape under the wings of the state, and on the other hand there is the sense that this state let us down in many aspects. Well, I think that thinking about the state organized our public discussions. In the past we had that the state should be eliminated. It was in the 90s, but then there was this moment when we started highlighting that we need a strong state, able state. This was a moment when we decided that maybe we should spend more money to make sure that institutions function better. So what is the point that we are at right now? How do we define this state? How do we describe this state? And let me revert back to my original question. Have the politicians noticed in the first place, and which kind of idea of the state will win the elections? It's easiest to answer this question if this pertains to Law and Justice, because Law and Justice decided to be more like themselves, so they want to have more state. Everything is now national, everything is centralized, everything is state. At the level of institutions, it is also a praise of the voivode role. We also see the centralization of everything. Everything is attached and is managed by Chancellor of the Prime Minister, and its head Minister Dworczyk is now dealing with everything. If you need to construct a temp hospital at the National Stadium, it is him. If you need to vaccinate 32 million of Poles, it is Mr. Dworczyk who is dealing with that. So a response of law and justice to all these problems and pains is more state, more centralization, and more of the national adjective. So also more of the Minister Dworczyk and Prime Minister Morawiecki, of course, with this caveat that Prime Minister prefers to hide behind the ministers if there is some problem, but if we are easing the restrictions, it is Prime Minister Morawiecki who is announcing it. And what about the opposition? I have to admit that I don't remember that any mention of state would be mentioned by Trzaskowski and Budka during their presentation about 2 weeks ago. So we know what the left will say, but I'm also curious how Szymon Hołownia defines the role of the state. Well, there is a couple of opposition parties, so a couple of definitions. So it would be easiest to describe what's happening on this extreme right. So I'm referring to Konfederacja, which is which is against the restrictions. It supported the rebellion of entrepreneurs against all the restrictions. And formally, maybe not formally, but they say that they don't believe in pandemic, they don't believe in coronavirus as such. It's just, you know, a nasty flu or nasty cold, which sometimes gets complicated, but it's not all that large and big of a deal to close down the economy. So there is a certain niche of electorate which listens to this kind of statements, and thanks to this, probably Confederation could survive at its level of a couple of percentage points, which enables it to enter the parliament. When it comes to the main opposition parties, centrist parties, or center-left or liberal, I have a problem, quite honestly, because I cannot tell you. You referred to this conference by Borys Budka and Rafał Trzaskowski, and I think it was already pointed by Rafał Kalukin in Polityka Weekly article that they presented a diagnosis of the weakness of the state. Borys Budka presented this weakness, but in response, what they presented was irrelevant because they said what was wrong, but the remedies was to introduce a referendum to dismiss an MP. They talked about increasing National Białowieski Park, also banning garbage imports. So it wasn't a clear-eyed vision how a state should be strengthened, facilitated, in which areas it should be strengthened, where it should be devolutioned. So in the civic platform, we see this thinking to devolve and decentralize, but I have a sense that it is not very well coordinated. And at the margins of the civic platform, they are speaking about the liquidation, elimination of the position of a governor, voivode, and it could be taken over by a marshal of the province. It is not a very well thought over idea. It also required a change of constitution. So I have the sense that this thinking about the state in the civic platform is fledgling. I'm surprised because I think that the word of the state and the vision of the state could be response to 500+. Because if the opposition wanted to close the chapter in Polish public life where 500+ was a king, I think 500+ was out of definition a problem. But it was just a social transfer of money to the citizens, and what was missing in this thinking about 500+ was to strengthen the institutions. So maybe that could be the subsequent stage of development. And law and justice could also do it. They could say, we gave you 500 plus, and now we'll have an idea what to do with the state. Now let us move on to the rebellion or protest. I think we've seen it all. We see more of the rebellious spirit on the streets. We had young youth, farmers, women, entrepreneurs. I'm just wondering how this anger can be canalized into politics, and are these parallel processes, or we will see a moment when these two processes meet? I think this is quite an interesting question, and one could pose it in 2016 and 17 when we had a protest of the Committee for Defense of Democracy. We also had a quite large protest in many cities. We saw also the protest when some acts on judiciary were proceeded, and that forced the hand of President Duda to veto some of these bills. And what happened? From the standpoint of the political parties, not much, because that rebellion withered away or just died out or was absorbed by existing parties or was partly dissipated. Not much is left of Committee for Defense of Democracy. We see some weak structures as a remnant. We see some activists who moved to politics maybe, but right now it is not a significant political force, and nothing much has left of the anti-judiciary reform protest. We see these people, they are active in social media, in traditional media, on Twitter, but it hasn't transformed into a large force. But why? Well, probably because it wasn't the right moment. We didn't have an election, and right now we also don't have an election. Well, should election happen in 2 months, I can imagine that, for example, the Polish women's strike could create its a list of candidates, or force the left party to let them be the candidates. But when we take a look at 3 years before the next election, it is difficult to judge what will happen when it comes to the future of these rebellious forces. Undoubtedly, just like Committee for Defense of Democracy and judiciary movement will be absorbed partly by the existing parties. It's been happening, actually. The civic platform says about the abortion using a language which is quite close to the language of the street protest. If we didn't have them, probably the civic platform would have never say anything in the near future. So probably this transition from the street to the politics is very difficult, and what the street is capable of doing is to shift a public discussion, to shift the accents of this public discussion. Let us move on to something which is underlying all this protest. I'm talking to anger and anxiety and frustration. I'm wondering how these feelings are solidifying the polarization, and to which extent they are creating new splits, new divides, and create new ideas, maybe new parties, maybe new leaders, but also new areas of the dispute. When you are referring to polarization, you are meaning this old polarization. Now, let me rephrase my question. Assuming that the polarization is here to stay, maybe the polars will change. It is quite a tempting notion, but I would lean towards the notion that the world will stay as is, unless the civic platform is replaced by Poland 2050, but I don't think we will see the reversal of the polars, we will have the same dispute. As a matter of fact, even the people who are around Szymon Hołownia, many of them are just former associates of Donald Tusk. So this is just the platform 2.0 with a new leader. But around him, we see a lot of people who are closely connected to Civic Platform, and this transfer that we've seen towards Szymon Hołownia are also the people from coalition. Well, let us stop. It is difficult to argue with what you say, but I was just wondering whether the Civic Platform was Freedom Union 2.0, because I think that the emergence of every new movement, political movement that is in this country so far, was created by people who already were in the politics. I don't think that apart from self-defense, we could see any significant political force which would be started at a grassroots level. They were always drawing on experienced politicians, but I think the person of a leader and reconfiguring the program has always been creating a new quality. So it's not to, I wouldn't agree that fully that this is Civic Platform 2.0. The platform was not a new freedom union, but it was born as a result of personal conflict of Bronisław Geremek, Donald Tusk. Donald Tusk was eliminated from the management of Freedom Union. So this was the first step to the inception of the Civic Platform. Shortly afterwards, the Freedom Union disappeared from the political stage. So here the Civic Platform is protected by state subsidies, its power in self-local government, so it will probably will not share the same fate as Freedom Union. But if you were to say, well, what are 5 points differing clearly Szymon Hołownia from Borys Budka, I would struggle. Well, we don't know much because Szymon Hołownia is speaking much and he's just developing his program. Well, Platforma has been around for 20 years and we still don't know much about them. Well, please answer the question whether the polarization, as we've seen, will organize our political life in 2021 or 2022, or maybe it will organize the political stage before the election in 2023. Well, it's not to say that this polarization has not been changing, because in 2015 and before that, Jarosław Kaczyński, who is the greatest expert at polarization of polls, together with his associates who are using the polls, divided Poland into social Poland versus liberal Poland. So this division ensured a string of successes because we saw more people in favor of social Poland. But since 2019 the divide is different, and it's also defined by Jarosław Kaczyński. It is traditional Poland versus I'm struggling to find the right word. A Poland of civilization of death, LGBT ideology, gender Poland, all these monsters that he's conjuring up. So I think that the right is trying to petrify this kind of divide, because the social Poland is no longer such a resounding slogan, because they are running out of money and no kind of incantations will change it. Was he successful in introducing this divide? I think that in European election it was effective. But since 2019, much happened. Well, they won all the elections using the same trump card. So far it's been successful. Well, the war which will happen is 2023, and until then, the axis can change. I was just wondering whether the last election that we were the witnesses of, the battle of Rafał Trzaskowski with Andrzej Duda, all these rebellions, all these marches, the arrival of Hołownia is not heralding a great explosion that we will, that maybe we'll see our return to the community, and this will be an antithesis to the polarization. And a politician who will come and tell to all these tired people who are so tired of the shouting match between the opposition and the government, I have a different idea, I have a recipe how to come together, become the community and move forward. Maybe this is a main question, to find this junctions, not something which divides us. Well, you can say again that I'm speaking about the previous battles, but the previous experience shows us that such voices with some hope, some centrist voices and ideas, seeking to find some rationalism in community. Well, these forces were doing well when we didn't have election. So the party of the rational center was most successful between elections. But when we had elections, the logic of polarization and election campaign and the battle for the vote, even in the language, we can see that it is military, the head of staff of the election. These are all military connotations and references. So this polarization is winning in elections. So I don't believe that this rational, calm center with this narrative of developing community will win an elections. Right now, following the street protests, CBOS done a poll on the identification of polls, and it seems that center is shrinking and people are moving towards the left. But this is the first poll of this kind. We will see what will be the evolution of it. Well, I will leave you the last word in these discussions. If we are sticking to this logic of polarization, do we see any redefinition here, or are we reaching a moment when this anti-government energy will be stronger than this pro-government energy? Maybe this law and justice in government is bursting at seams, and maybe the opposition will get its act together and they will be able to take advantage of the voice of the people who used to vote for law and justice, but they are no longer willing to do it. I don't know whether you share my view, but I have a sense of the twilight, even though this parliamentary term just started. I have a sense that it is just burning out, that the government is dying out, but also the opposition is not in a greatest shape. But maybe that's a result of this horrible, catastrophic year that we've had. And the second thing, on the side of the government, I don't see any energy. I've been talking to the politicians from the Law and Justice, United Poland, the Agreement Party, and I don't see much of the energy in the United Right. I've been talking to them for 10 years, so I have a good idea of how their energy evolved since 2014, and since they took power, I don't remember them being in such a bad shape, not having any fresh ideas, with eroded trust. I don't think they can come together. I don't think they can recover from the losses in the polls. And when we see the deepening crisis in the polls, it will work against the United Right. So maybe you should speak to Daniel Obajtek, because he seems to be so powerful and full of energy. Well, I'll be more than pleased. On the opposition side, even though civic platform does not seem so vigorous, we have Szymon Hołownia, who is going up. So I see more opportunities for the opposition to change something, and maybe at the expense of the existing forces. Maybe we will no longer see the Peasants' Party. Maybe the civic platform will be reduced to a small party. Maybe center-left or center party at the level of 10–15%, and maybe Szymon Hołownia will become a leader of the polls on the opposition side. So much may happen, but in 2021, at the beginning, it seems that the times are better for the opposition and worse for the government. If the presidential election happened today in February, who would have won? I know that this is a very difficult question, but let's try to do this thought experiment, reflecting the level of energy that you see on both sides. I cannot answer this question, but I think in 2020, Andrzej Duda had the last moment to win any election. So I think you very eloquently answered this question. Wojciech, finally, let us get back to our tested ritual questions. I wanted to pose a question: when the election will happen, who will be running and who will win? Well, I always respond in the same way. I don't believe in early election, because this is a formidable operation. You would have to find 307 MPs to support the early election. I think that this configuration will last until 2023, unless we have 20 Law and Justice MPs and they will move to the opposition, or something like that will happen. So the election in 2023, who will run? Well, certainly Law and Justice, but I'm not sure what will be the exact configuration, and I don't think that we will see the repetition of the last two campaigns. We no longer see United Right. We will have Law and Justice plus, but without United Poland, without Agreement Party, and without one component of the Agreement Party by Jarosław Gowin. And on the opposition side, I think that we already have a configuration that we know. I'm curious what will happen to the Peasants' Party if it still continues to struggle in the polls. Maybe they will start an alliance with Szymon Hołownia. And the biggest riddle is what will happen with Szymon Hołownia, because we've seen already a number of parties which were soaring very high, not having too much traction in the field. I remember a poll where Nowoczesna, the modern party, was winning with the civic platform, but then we saw what happened. So as for now, it seems that Szymon Hołownia has a lot of trump cards, but in a year we may talk and say that the civic platform has the upper hand and is able to change the Law and Justice. Well, I know that you are not dealing with Konfederacja on every daily basis, but what will happen to them? Konfederacja is an artificial being uniting different groups, and I would not be surprised if it divided and part of it moved to Law and Justice, and part of them joined the opposition, more mainstream opposition. Much might happen there. I thought about a scenario which I'm not sure will materialize, I like it as a certain intellectual construct that we tried to assign confederation to various existing political forces, but it doesn't match. But I think that if confederation split or divided into three groups, I can imagine that these remnants of Korwin party without Korwin-Mikke would match the agreement. The question is which agreement, but the national element matches the united Poland, and I think we would have some people who would be comfortable at Law and Justice. So I think that Konfederacja and their voters can be a reservoir of votes which would go to other right movements. I fully agree. Thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you, and see you next time.